My name is Elise Higgins, and today I'm going to be showing you the different types of joint movements. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the scapular movements. And the first movements I'm going to show you is elevation and depression. So elevation of the scapular would basically just be shrugging your shoulders up. So think like bringing your shoulders straight towards the ceiling. And then depression, let me move my hair out of the way, would just be bringing your shoulders back down. So this is elevation and then depression. The next movements of the scapula I'm going to show you are abduction and adduction. So the first one is abduction with a B. So what you're going to do is you're going to bring your shoulders forwards. So think like you're moving your scapula away from the midline. So you would be like this. And then for adduction, you would be bringing them back. So you're bringing your shoulder blades together and bringing your scapula towards the midline. So think like this. Okay, next is scapular upward rotation and downward rotation. So for scapular upward rotation, you are going to bring your arms up above your head, which is bringing your scapulas up. And then for downward rotation, you're just going to bring them back down. So upward rotation, downward rotation. And I'll do that from the side. Upward rotation, downward rotation. Now we are moving into the shoulder movement. So first we have flexion and extension of the shoulders. So for shoulder flexion, you are just going to bring your arms up above your head, and that is flexing your shoulders. And then for extension, you're going to bring your arms back down and then bring them towards the back a little bit. That is shoulder extension. So for shoulder abduction and adduction, we're going to start with shoulder abduction. So what you're going to do is you're going to bring your arm up to the side and up a little bit, and that is shoulder abduction because you're moving it away from the midline. And then for shoulder adduction, you're going to bring it back down and across a little bit, and that is shoulder adduction. My bad. Next we have shoulder external and internal rotation. So for internal rotation, you're going to start with your hand out by your side like this, and you're going to rotate it in towards the midline. And then for external rotation, you're going to rotate it out away from the midline and distally. So internal, external. Next is horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. So what you want to do is start with your hand like this, your arm like this, and I like to think like put it in line with your collarbone. So for horizontal abduction, you're going to take it and you're going to move it away from your chest and away from the midline. And then if you want to do horizontal adduction, you will just move it back in towards the midline and towards your chest. So horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Now is diagonal abduction and diagonal adduction. So for this, instead of just moving your arm up and down or side to side, you're going to do it diagonally. So for diagonal abduction, you're going to move your arm up away from the midline and diagonally. So like I'm a cheerleader, so in cheer, this would be like a high V. So think like up and away from the midline diagonally. And then for diagonal adduction, you're going to move it down and across the midline, towards the midline diagonally. So diagonal abduction, diagonal adduction. Okay, next we're going to do the elbow movements. So the first two are elbow flexion and extension. So to do these, you want to start in anatomical position with your arms down and straight. And for elbow flexion, you're going to bend at your elbows, bring your arms up. And I like to think palms to shoulders, not really like put them on your shoulders, but think just lift your palm towards your shoulders. And that is elbow flexion. And then for elbow extension, you're going to start with your palms like this, so like palms touching shoulders, but not really. And you're just going to bring them back down to anatomical position, and that is elbow extension. So elbow flexion, elbow extension. And then the other elbow movements are elbow pronation and elbow supination. So you're going to start in anatomical position, and then for pronation, you're going to bring your elbows up and rotate them over. So think palms facing the floor. And then for supination, you're going to go from your palms facing the floor back to anatomical position. So this is elbow pronation, and then this is elbow supination. Okay, now we are going to move into the forearm and wrist movements. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about wrist flexion and extension, and then wrist adduction, also known as ulnar deviation, and wrist abduction, known as radial deviation. So for wrist flexion, you're going to start in anatomical position, and you're going to think bringing palms towards the body. So this would be wrist flexion. And then for extension, you're going to start at anatomical position and think bring backwards. So like palms towards the floor. So wrist flexion, extension. And then for wrist adduction and abduction, you're going to start at anatomical position. So for adduction, you're going to bring your wrist, like point your fingers towards your hips, and that is ulnar deviation and wrist adduction. So your wrists are going in towards the midline. And then for wrist abduction or radial deviation, you're going to start in anatomical position and your wrists are going outwards, away from the midline. So wrist adduction, wrist abduction. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about for the wrist and forearms are the flexion of the fingers and thumb, which is opposition, and then extension of the fingers and thumbs, which is reposition. So I'm going to get a little closer. So for flexion, you'll start in anatomical position, and then you're going to act like you're grasping to pick something up. So like you would pick something up. That is fingers and thumb flexion or opposition. So like you would go to pick up like buckets or something maybe. And then for fingers and thumb extension or reposition, you're going to go from the grasp or curled position and then just open them back up. So this is flexion or opposition, and then this is extension or reposition. And then the next part of the wrist and forearm are metacarpal and phalangeal joints abduction and metacarpal and phalangeal joints adduction. So for metacarpal and phalangeal joints abduction, you're going to start in anatomical position and spread your fingers out. So that is the metacarpal and phalangeal joints abduction. And then for adduction, you're going to go from anatomical position and squeeze your fingers together. So this is abduction and then adduction. So bring them out, squeeze them together. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the hip movements. So the first ones I'm going to talk about are flexion and extension of your hip and like your pelvic girdle. So for flexion, I'm going to stand like this so you can see. You're going to bring your leg up and it's going to be bent like a tabletop, so like it's flat. So you bring it up and it's flat. And this is known as hip flexion because your hip is flexed. And then for hip extension, you're going to bring your leg down and straight backwards, which is extending this hip. So this would be flexion, and then this would be extension. Movement for the hip are abduction and adduction. So for adduction, you're going to start and you're going to bring your leg straight away from the midline. So you just bring it away from the midline, and that is hip abduction. And then for adduction, you're kind of crossing your leg over and you're bringing it towards the midline. So like this. So this would be adduction and this would be abduction. And then you have diagonal abduction and diagonal adduction, which they're both very similar to abduction and adduction, but for diagonal adduction, you want to think move your leg, but like diagonally away. So it's going to be kind of to the back. So you move it diagonally away from the midline, which is diagonal abduction. And then diagonal adduction is you move your leg across your body and diagonally towards the midline. So like you would kick a ball, like if you're kicking a soccer ball, you would move it like that. So this is diagonal abduction, diagonal adduction. Okay, so the next movements we have for the hip are external rotation and internal rotation. So I'm going to kind of scoot back a little bit so you can see. So for for these two movements, you're either going to be turning your foot out or in. So for external rotation, you're going to think turn your foot away from the midline, which is external rotation of the hip. And then for internal rotation of the hip, you're going to think turn your foot inwards to the midline. So this is internal rotation, external rotation. So in dance, you would like stand like this, which is external rotation. And then this would be internal rotation. Okay, and then the last two for the hip movements are anterior pelvic rotation and posterior pelvic rotation. So I'm going to turn to the side so you can see. So for anterior pelvic rotation, you're going to think curve your spine and stick your hips backwards and kind of like lift your butt towards the ceiling. So this is anterior pelvic rotation. And then for posterior pelvic rotation, you're going to make your spine more neutral and bring your hips forward. So this is posterior pelvic rotation. Anterior pelvic rotation, posterior pelvic rotation. The next joint movements we have are for your knees. So the first two are knee flexion and knee extension. So you're going to start in anatomical position. And then for knee flexion, you're going to bend your knee and bring your legs backwards behind you with it bent. So this would be knee flexion. So you're flexing that knee. And then for knee extension, you're going to have your foot flat on the floor and your leg is completely straight and there's no bending in the knee. So this would be flexion, your knee's bent. And then for extension, bring it back down and straight. Okay, and the last two movements for the knee are external rotation and internal rotation. So for both of these, your knee is going to be flexed. So I'm going to start with external rotation. So your knee is going to be flexed and you're going to bring it away from the midline. So I'm going to turn to the back so you can see. So this is external rotation. So you're bringing it away from you. And then for internal rotation, you're going to bring your knee towards the midline. So this would be internal rotation. External rotation, internal rotation. So the next joint movements are of the ankle. So the first two are dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So for dorsiflexion, you're going to be sitting down and you're going to think flex your foot by bringing your toes towards the body like this. And then for plantar flexion, you're going to be sitting down and you're going to think point your foot by bringing your toes away from your body. So dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. The next ones are toe flexion and toe extension. So for toe flexion, you're curling your toes up, if you can see. So my toes are curled up and they're moving away from my ankle. And then for toe extension, you're bringing your toes up towards your ankle. So this would be toe flexion and this would be toe extension. And then we have pronation and supination. So for pronation, you are going to be standing like this. And pronation is basically standing on the outsides of your ankles. So like if you get hurt and you roll your ankle, you are pronating your ankle, which I have done many of times. And then for supination, it's basically standing on the insides of your ankles. So if you roll it inwards, you're supinating your ankle. So pronation, supination. The next movements are the attalontaxial movements. Sorry, I couldn't say that. So those are spinal flexion and spinal extension. So what you're going to want to do for spinal flexion, you're going to want to have your hands and knees on the ground like so, and think of your back as a tabletop. So for spinal flexion, you're lifting your spine up towards the ceiling. So think, bring your belly button towards your spine. So that is spinal flexion. And then for spinal extension, your hands and knees are on the ground and you're pushing your spine towards the floor. So think spine to belly button. Flexion, extension. Okay, so our last joint movements are of the lumbar spine. So the first one is lumbar flexion. So I'm going to do it from the side. So curve forward and think like you're doing a crunch or a sit-up. So put your hands on your heads. And this would be lumbar flexion. So it's like I'm doing a sit-up. And then lumbar extension is from the side. So my hands are up and you're just extending your back. And then you can also do hyperextension, which is going further. So like you'd be going back to do a back bend. So flexion, extension, hyperextension. And then we have lumbar lateral flexion to the right. So you're gonna put your hand on your head and you're gonna lean towards the right like you're doing a side crunch. And you're flexing the left side of your lumbar spine. And then lumbar rotation to the right is your hands are on your head and you're rotating the top of your body towards the right. So think like you would try to pop your back. So how people pop their backs like this, you're rotating towards the right. And that is the lumbar spine.